book and I left the book at home.
Oh, that's all right.
You can use mine if you want.
Yeah,
I've
a
got,
copy.
well, where is it? This week's reading, what every high school student should know. I did read it. I have to open it up.
The first section, what science is. I was like, oh, this is going to be good. And
Yeah.
then I turned the page, I was like, wait, what? That's it? It's barely like a paragraph. What?
They're all so short.
It's so, like, there's so much left on the table there.
Yeah,
Personally, I think that's like the more important of the three sections. Because there was what science is, and then there was the various ways that science is practiced, and then the last one is why science is important. And I think 2 and 3 kind of just fall under 1, so I suppose maybe 1 wasn't that short.
well, go ahead and lead because I'm gonna, I like I said, I only read it
That's all right.
one
That's all
time. Usually I try to read the class. So yeah, what science is, the various ways it's practiced, and why science is important.
So they give a definition in the book about, well, they give a couple of definitions. One, in America, about 40 states' departments of education define science roughly
Oh
as
yeah,
investigating the natural world through the use of observation, experimentation, and logical argument.
mm-hmm.
What do you think of that definition?
What do I think about it?
Do you like it? Do you think it covers the scope of science pretty well?
Well, I can't think of anything to add to it. The part about experimentation, I mean, there's a lot of things. Our class, it's hard to experiment on some of the things, but I'm not going to rule out experimentation. Logical. Yeah, it seems okay to me. Go ahead, tell me what's wrong with it.
No, I don't know that there's anything wrong with it. It's just, I think most people tend to put a lot of stock in science. I think because science offers answers through observable means.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can't see it, if you can't touch it, if you can't hear it, it's not real. At least that seems to be the philosophy that a lot of people live by. And so science to them offers the comfort and security of certainty. I think people demand certainty about their knowledge. And so science seems to be, the end all be all for a lot of people because, if you can test it and you can reproduce it, then it's effectively proof. And it's interesting because then they go on to say only Massachusetts and Kansas have proposed restricting science by a definition that only allows unguided natural causes to explain what is observed.
Mm-hmm.
So why students should know why this restriction is controversial, and then they just cut it off there. It's kind of like, well, tell us, Michael Newton Keyes, why is that restriction controversial?
And when they say unguided natural causes, that's kind of what we were talking about, the first cause.
Mm-hmm.
So I was surprised at Massachusetts. I could almost see Kansas being conservative, but I didn't see Massachusetts.
Yeah, the education system in Massachusetts is a hotbed of academia. So I think politically it's a little separate from its academia. I wouldn't be surprised that the academic sphere in New England would be more liberal than conservative, and not necessarily politically liberal, but liberal academically, more open to. Well, I suppose that would probably be more conservative because, in an academic sense, conservatism would be hesitant to be open to ideas outside of what can be seen and observed and what's within the scope of science.
So then there's 40 and 2, so that means there's 8 other states that have different definitions.
So,
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't observed that. Because he says, about 40 state departments have this definition, plus these other 2. So what about the other 8?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
well, and so at the bottom, I don't think that's what the rest of the pages are.
Oh, let me see.
It sounds like he's leaving it open. But I think the idea of this is that's one way to view science as unguided and natural. So they're using academia as a whole. Most of them view science as right, unguided and natural causes. So if it doesn't fall within those parameters, well, then it's not acceptable. So it's viewing science from only this. Well, why does it have to be unguided and natural? Who said that? That was one guy's idea and they stuck with it. And so you're narrowing your window of things.
That's an interesting observation, because he does go on to talk about how students should also recognize how different beliefs shape scientific practice. This is another form of methodological pluralism. And he talks about like the Babylonians and other philosophical backgrounds, religious backgrounds, belief systems that shape scientific practice. And so there seems to be a presumption, a belief background that informed that decision.
Because they quote through all this whole essay, the National Science Education Standards.
Mm-hmm.
So on the last page, or before that, so they say the Darwin-only approach to education and life sciences often point to the National Science Education Standards to bolster their position. But then a couple lines down it says, ironically, statements in the NSES support the major points in this essay. The NSES calls on all students to identify their assumptions, use critical and logical thinking, and consider alternative explanations. So science, they even say, most scientists don't say that. We got to be open to all reason and all explanations and alternatives. And
Right, because the
unless-
very next sentence he says, if
Yeah.
students simply swallow Darwin whole as a fact, then how do they become critical, skeptical scientific thinkers?
Now, where are you at here so I can follow? I
It's
know
the
I just
last-
saw.
it's the
any
last
page
couple.
72, which is
It's the last couple of paragraphs. The second to last paragraph.
Oh, there they are.
Yeah, he says if students are simply told to swallow Darwin whole as a fact, that's a great way to put that, because that's essentially what it is. Like, the NSES encourages students to identify assumptions, use critical and logical thinking, and consider alternative explanations. Well, if you just swallow, certain scientific dogmas whole, then are you really thinking critically and considering alternative explanations?
Do you think that they give any voice to alternatives in schools? I mean, any voice at all? Or do you think it really truly is just presenting Darwin as this is the truth, this is the only way it is, and nothing else?
I think
Just
it
what do you
depends
think?
on the school.
Mhm.
Today, I'm not sure. I can say that when I was in high school in 2004, 2005, 2006, in Texas, Darwinian evolution was presented kind of gently as a theory, but it wasn't like pushed hard as a fact. That may just have been, a product of more conservative Texas public schools. But maybe I was just naive and not, maybe I was unaware of the pressures of the public education system to subscribe to that particular worldview. But I didn't feel like it was like, this is a fact. It was, from what I recall, it was more gentle, like, This is the generally accepted theory. So
Yeah, and
How about you, Randy?
from my experience, it's similar to that. And I'll add to it, they didn't have alternatives. That, at least in my experience, this is the theory.
yeah, that's true. I would say that alternative. Well, I suppose that was more in like social studies where creation narratives, creation myths were talked about in other classes, not in science. So, but yeah, we did talk about like Atlas and the giant turtle and stuff like that more in like the literature and social studies classes. But I don't remember it being so dogmatic. It was more just like this is the leading theory. It wasn't like this is the truth.
Mm-hmm.
It was more like this is just generally what the most popular theory is.
And they mentioned talking about all the different. So before that, they say a teach the controversy approach presents biology in a livelier and less dogmatic way. Students will learn science as actually practiced. Scientists often debate how to best interpret data, and they even argue over what counts as legitimate scientific explanation. Controversy is normal within science. Students will learn to distinguish better between evidence and inference. Students need these skills as citizens, whether they choose careers in science or other fields. Teaching multiple sides is an issues approach to science, has of late been recognized as a superior educational approach, not just in origins issues, but also in other areas. So,
I do remember only one case. Maybe there were others and I just don't recall, but there was only one case that I recall when I was in 9th grade. We learned about spontaneous generation and when science debunked the long-held belief that life spontaneously generates, using an experiment where they put a piece of meat in a jar and they would observe maggots appearing on the meat. And so, it was long held that the maggots would just spontaneously generate. They would just appear out of nowhere for no reason, uncaused. And so the experiment was to cover the meat. They would put a piece of meat in a jar and then cover it. And then they had it right next to another jar that was uncovered. And the uncovered jar, of course, produced maggots, and the covered jar did not. And so the conclusion was that the maggots are eggs laid by flies that have access to the meat in the jar. The jar that's covered did not produce maggots because the flies could not get into the jar to lay eggs and hatch maggots. And so thus spontaneous generation was disproven. And so that was, I think that's the only case of this type of teaching approach where they teach the controversy and present the alternatives to the students. But I don't remember alternatives in other scientific theories presented, particularly origins of the universe, origins of life, things like that. It was mainly just, here's the leading theory. This is what most people accept.
I have no recall what they taught when I was in high school. I have no recall. Randy, you were just reading this, and it all kind of comes back a little bit, but when they're talking about issues approach, how would you guys talk about what issues approach means? Because sometimes when I read stuff like this is almost like that first philosophy class when I came in and said it went over my head. Now maybe if I'd have read it a second or a third time, but as I'm looking at it again, it's familiar,
Yeah.
but I don't know what issues
So,
approach is.
an issues approach would be, because what's typically done for like what we've been talking about is they'll talk about evolution and Darwin, and they're just cherry picking the good parts about Darwin and not the issues. the things that are,
Yeah, there's no emphasis on the uncertainty.
so if you have multiple sets of data, multiple theories and ideas, you could compare them. Actually, talk about that, just like that. Where is that? I'll find it here. I think it's right here.
So when you're saying teach the controversy, that's when they're willing to discuss things outside the standard line.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that brings up an interesting point. Why do you suppose academia and the education system and the scientific community would be hesitant to the teach the controversy approach?
Why do I think so? My mind keeps going back to that video that Randy showed last week about expelled and people being kicked out because they were teaching, and if I'm understanding this right, the controversy, that they're showing that it doesn't make sense. So why do they do that? They're threatened for some reason, and maybe it gets back to they would have to acknowledge at some point, if they take the arguments all the way, that there's at least an uncaused cause, if not a God. Is that anywhere close to what you're thinking?
Well, yeah, definitely. I think they're threatened. I think to teach the controversy like that, teach the controversy approach, I think they're hesitant or resistant to it because I think it threatens to undermine the credibility of science because.
Of
There we
science?
go.
Yeah, because like I said, people put all of their eggs into the basket of certainty. They want certainty. They want to know with absolute confidence that they have the truth. And so if you put emphasis on this teach the controversy approach, then that, don't you think, would undermine the certainty that they so desperately want? And it's not, I don't think it's so much a scientific community thing. I think it's just a human thing. People, just it's human nature. People want certainty. You know, they want to be absolutely confident that the information they have is absolutely true. And so if in the science, in the science classroom and in academia and the science community, the teach the controversy approach is elevated higher, I think there's a fear that it's going to undermine the credibility of science because people want to know that it's absolutely true. I keep doing this, I'm sorry, but I think that's why they're hesitant to do it, because they want science. People elevate science to the level of religion. People worship science as this like new religion because it offers certainty. If you can observe it, if you can test it, if you can prove it scientifically, then it's a fact. And so I think that appeals to the desperate need that people have for certainty.
It's multifaceted for sure. There's depending on science, what they find to be quote unquote true or factual will have far-reaching implications into society and political and moral, ethical. All it affects everything. Can affect everything. The way people think. If they were to find out 100% for sure that God's not real, we evolved, what would that do to the world?
Well, how could they?
No, right.
Because
This is
that's
theoretical.
The thing
Yeah,
that how could you?
But,
How is that
but people
possible?
think that. They go, oh yeah, science is true. God's not real. They proved it, but they haven't done the research. So then their whole worldview, the way they think and act, right, is shaped by that, or part by that.
Well,
So-
see, that's a really good point. I think people have been led implicitly, maybe not explicitly, or maybe in some cases they have been told explicitly, but I think in general it's more implicit that science and the scientific approach has access to all areas of knowledge, and that's simply not true. I think that's why people worship science as a new religion, because people are under the assumption or the belief that anything can be tested and proven or disproven scientifically. And that just simply isn't true. And that's why I'm disappointed about how short the "what science is" paragraph is, because he doesn't, the author doesn't do any justice. He doesn't treat the limitations of the scope of science. I think a lot of people, even within the church, don't recognize the limitations of science. I think it'd be edifying to share this. There are at least 5 things that science cannot explain. There are at least 5 things that are outside the scope of science. I'm sure there's more, but I think for the benefit of sharing your faith and talking about God with other people, I think knowing these 5 things would be really helpful. So the first thing, or one thing, and there's not really in any particular order, but one thing that science does not have access to are math and logical truths, statements. So you cannot test math or logic scientifically. There's no way, you just can't. Science presupposes the truth of math and logic. Math and logic are a language to describe the world that science kind of appropriates, if you will, to describe the explanatory scope of science.
Now, what do you mean? Because you've used that argument, the assumption, the conclusion. Doesn't that prove itself? Because it makes sense.
Right, but that's not accessible by science. Science presupposes the truth of logic. So, like with syllogisms and sentential logic and things like that, that's wholly separate from science. Science cannot access math and logic. Math and logic are used by science, but you can't test 2 + 2 = 4 scientifically. Like the discipline of science is more about making the hypothesis, testing it, observing the results, and interpreting the data. But if you were to write 2 + 2 = 4 on the board, you're not conducting a scientific experiment.
So if they took 2 apples and 2 more apples and found 4 apples, that's not observable?
Well, yeah, that is observable, but that's already presupposing the truth of the method of addition. You're taking the mathematical operation of addition to be true in and of itself already. You're presupposing the truth of the operation of addition. So that still exists wholly independent of the scientific experiment. So
I have to think about that.
science presupposes the truth of math and logic. Second would be metaphysical truths.
All right, what do you mean?
So metaphysical truths or metaphysical statements would be like, how could you prove scientifically that the universe was not created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age? You couldn't. Science doesn't have access to the metaphysical. Another example of a metaphysical statement would be that there are other minds in this room besides my own. I'm not the only mind here. I'm not the only person here. How could I prove scientifically that even I exist? Rene Descartes was famous for trying to prove that he existed. Well, you've heard the famous saying, "I think, therefore I am."
Yeah.
So what he was doing was he was saying, well, all 5 of our senses can be tricked. There are optical illusions. There are auditory illusions. All 5 of your senses can be deceived. So how do we do science? Well, we do science by observation. So if every way you observe can be tricked, can be lied to, how could I prove scientifically that I exist? And so Rene Descartes' conclusion was, well, I can think, so therefore I know that I exist, at least I exist. But that's a metaphysical truth. There's no scientific way to prove your own existence consciously. Consciousness is not acceptable. Is not accessible by science. Consciousness is something metaphysical. It's outside the realm of this scientifically testable realm, if you will.
So you're saying consciousness is not acceptable in science?
Accessible.
Accessible. So is that kind of like when I first come in here and I said, the only thing I remember from my philosophy class is how do you know you're not a brain in a jar and you're being manipulated?
Right.
Is that kind of like what we're
Exactly.
talking about?
How could you prove scientifically that you're not just a brain in a vat? Exactly. Yeah, that's a metaphysical truth. Because, like Rene Descartes said, all of your senses can be deceived. So science doesn't have access to things of the metaphysical, like the universe was created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. How could we possibly scientifically test to prove or disprove that? We couldn't.
Now the five senses, smell, taste, vision, hearing, and
Smell, taste, vision, hearing, and touch.
touch. So they say they can all be deceived.
Well, that was Rene Descartes, at least. All of them can be tricked in some way or another. So, do we have reasonable, dependence on those senses? Now, someone who puts all their eggs into the scientific basket would say that science accounts for that with reproducibility. So if you test a theory and you reproduce the same results over and over and over again, that compensates for that that unreliability of having your senses deceived. But anyway, so metaphysical. So
Okay.
science doesn't have access to the metaphysical. Number 3 would be morality. So you can't prove scientifically why it's wrong to torture a child for fun. Ethical statements of value and duty is inaccessible by science. Science, you can't show scientifically why altruism is good or valuable. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm going to ask a question as I'm writing this down when you say it can't be true. So if we were to interview the world and they all said that it's wrong to torture a child for fun, would that be a huge experiment?
Well, it wouldn't. Sure, it would be an experiment, but it would only be about the experiment would only have access to the ubiquity of that belief.
Ubiquity.
Like it would only have access to how many people actually believe that, but it wouldn't have access to the actual truth of the statement. So you couldn't prove true or false whether or not it was right or wrong to torture a child for fun. All you would be doing is learning about how many people believe it. So let me ask you a question. If, let's say, everyone on planet Earth took a pill and suddenly everyone on Earth, including you and me, as a result of taking that pill, now believe that it is not only acceptable, but it's good, it's right, it's valuable to torture children for fun. Does that make it good and right and valuable to torture children for fun? if everyone agrees that it's good and right and acceptable and valuable to torture children for fun, if we all agree, does that make it true?
No.
Right. So the truth of the claim exists independent of the belief of the people who have it. So that's the point that I'm making about morality is inaccessible by science. You can't prove the truth of that statement because it's metaphysical, I suppose. And the same is true for aesthetic. I don't know how to count. The same is true for aesthetic statements. Beautiful things like the good are not accessible. I want to say accessible by science. You can't prove why something is beautiful. Now, beauty and arguments for the objectivity of beauty is that's a much slipperier slope. I actually have never really considered the argument for God's existence from beauty until we went to. Were you in that? Yeah, you were in there. That's right. I remember you sat in front of me. We went to a apologetics conference in Denver last November and heard Doug Groteis give a talk about the argument from beauty. And the argument from beauty is essentially the moral argument. So, the objectivity of moral values and duties is rooted in God. So it is wrong to torture children for fun, not because we all agree that it is, but because God says that it is. It's objectively true for everyone. And the same is true for beauty. That's going to be a lot trickier to convince someone because people are going to argue that all beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And that's true to a certain extent. But I think that there are cases of beauty that exist objectively independent of an observer. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but the point is that science doesn't have access to beauty. You can't prove that something is beautiful scientifically. Now, someone might argue that, you could use the science of psychology to explain why an observer reacts in a certain way that they do, but that's not what I'm talking about, because beauty is so much more than just what is in the eye of the beholder. I would argue that there are things that are beautiful independent of an observer. Even if there was no one there to observe it, it's still beautiful. I guess one example that I could give of that would be efficiency. So when you have a system of parts that work efficiently, I think that that's beautiful. I guess I say I think, but I think that there's beauty inherent. There's value, I should say. There's value inherent in that efficiency because the efficiency has a intrinsic value to it for its function. Does that make sense? I know that's terribly vague because I'm not giving more specific examples, but that's the best example that I can think of for something that would be beautiful, independent of an observer. So these two, morality and beauty, are pretty much linked. The fifth one will really surprise you. The fifth one, probably most remarkably, is science itself. Science is not, the truth of science is not scientifically provable.
Now, for example, like gravity. That's proven, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe a better example would be the speed of light. The speed of light is the speed of light is something that it's not the only thing. Science is permeated with these things. These are things that are just taken to be true in order for a whole host of other scientific theories to be held, like Einstein's special theory of relativity just takes the speed of light to be true. We can't really test or prove scientifically what that is. It's entirely theoretical. But let me give you a better example. You've heard the statement, only what can be scientifically proven should be taken as true. What about that sentence? Can you test the sentence, only that which can be scientifically proven should be taken as truth? How do you test that scientifically?
The statement itself is a
Statement
philosophical
itself.
statement.
Right.
Science isn't philosophy, they're two separate fields.
How did you say that again? Science?
Only statements that can be scientifically proven are true. Well, that's a statement. Can you test that statement scientifically? No. So then it's not true. Is it true that only statements that can be tested scientifically are true? Because that statement itself cannot be tested scientifically. So the point is that science itself, the truth of science cannot be scientifically proven because science is permeated with assumptions and beliefs that are scientifically untestable.
So one that jumps out to me in there that's not obvious unless, well, just is meaning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So science can tell you how something works, but not why it works.
Yes, that's who said that? It's Friedrich Nietzsche. So science, the explanatory scope of science can tell you how fire burns, but it can't tell you why fire burns the way that it does. So science can tell you that fire is an exothermic reaction of a combination of a combustible material with oxygen. Okay, that's the how. But why does fire burn the way that it does? Science can't tell you that. It can tell you how, but it can't tell you why.
All right, just a second. So you just gave that definition of fire.
Mhm.
So what do you mean they can't say why it burns that way?
It just burns the way that it does. From a scientific perspective, it seems that the arrangement of those components and that reaction, science can't explain why it is that way. It can only describe.
So for example, you need oxygen, fuel, and a source.
Mhm.
Why does it have to be oxygen? Why can't it have been something else?
Right. From
Carbon
a scientific
dioxide
perspective,
or-
it's arbitrary. It just seems to be, well, that's just the way it is because it's just the way it is. So it can describe how things are, how things work, but it can't describe why things work.
Like another good example of just how why statement would be humans. Like they said in this chapter, there's the two fields of science, the how things work, but not, what do we say, why, or the meaning of it, or whatever it said. So a lot of scientists, like there's the field of, okay, this is how we think we got here, evolution or spontaneous generation or whatever else they want to believe. But it doesn't tell us why we're here.
That would be a metaphysical truth.
Mhm. Yeah.
So the point is simply that science is limited in its explanatory scope. However, people put so much stock into it that they I think because people have a desperate need for certainty, and science, or at least those who practice science, it's not necessarily a feature of science itself, but the people, the scientists, the people who do science, often present science as an all-encompassing provider of certainty.
So in the video last week, there was the one atheist gentleman that had the brain tumor. I forget his name.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know you're talking about. I don't remember his name either, but I
So, and I appreciated his explanation. Richard Dawkins and a lot of other atheists come to this logical conclusion as well, that if we did just evolve, there is no God, then we do have no meaning and no purpose. We die, there's nothing.
Oh yeah, I remember him saying
There's
that.
no intrinsic or transcendent moral values. There's no absolute truths, there's no objective truths, everything's subjective, and
Can you explain the word you just used, transcendent?
transcendence would be something outside of ourselves. So not coming from us.
Well, it'd be outside of the physical universe, which
So-
science does not have access to.
So science, and so they talk about materialistic naturalism. That whole thought, materialistic naturalism, that practice, they say everything that they can be explained has to be explained using nature and unguided and nothing outside.
Why
of
do you
that.
suppose science makes that assertion?
There's actually a chapter on this too.
Before you go into that, materialistic naturalism was what?
I think it was in here actually.
Was it?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
It's the belief, and it's from another part of the book, the belief that in the final analysis, nature is all that there is, and that nature is essentially unmodified by anything other than itself. In other words, nature itself is thought to be the ultimate reality.
When they say nature, we're talking about not only human life or animal life. I mean, we're talking about storms.
Anything that exists in the physical universe.
And is that something that people support, or is that some?
Oh yeah, there
It's
are
a
a lot.
worldview.
Yeah, the last few sentences of this paragraph, in the various ways science is practiced, it says, scientists are influenced by societal, cultural, and personal beliefs and ways of viewing the world. Science is not separate from society, but rather science is part of society. Such an approach to science education would include discussion of the influence of naturalism in science. Naturalism, in its philosophical form, says that nothing beyond nature, that is the physical universe, is real. Nothing outside of the physical universe is real. This amounts to atheism. Naturalism in science has guided many scientists to limit themselves to material causes to explain the natural world. Because if it's not in the physical universe, then it's not observable, therefore not testable. So that's why naturalistic, or what does he call it? Methodological naturalism is problematic because it I would argue that it leads to narrow-mindedness. Because if you can't test it, if you can't see it, well, not necessarily see it, but if you can't observe it by some means, then it's not true.
And that will shape the way they do science and experiments and evaluate results and evidence. So, for example, there's a different type of dating systems. You have lead, uranium, carbon, all the different types of isotope datings. There's lots and lots and lots of studies. And they'll date this one piece of dinosaur bone or whatever it is. It comes back with 10 different results from 10 different labs. Some as young as 30,000 years, some as old as 3.4 billion years, or hundreds of millions of years. They're going to take the old results because it falls in line with their theory of evolution, that the Earth is old and evolved. But they have all these other results, they're young.
So they use their own bias.
Yes.
Well, let's think of another example. The resurrection of Jesus. What evidence do we have that Jesus was resurrected? Because resurrection, according to what we know about the human body, is, well, at least if you've been dead for 3 days, I mean, people have come back from the dead where they've been resuscitated and, but all that aside, someone who has been crucified, pierced, like made sure that they're dead, is they stabbed him with a spear and blood and water came out. He was dead, and stayed dead for 3 days and then came back to life. Science would tell us that that's not possible. However, we have a set of facts that point to Jesus' resurrection. So, we have the empty tomb. They put Jesus' dead body in the tomb, and he's not in the tomb anymore. We have the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. There were a whole bunch of witnesses that saw Jesus alive after he was supposedly dead.
Can I interject something?
Sure.
These proofs are coming from the Bible that supports that Jesus was resurrected. Are there outside proofs?
Mhm.
We had this discussion in one of our other studies, but I'm still not convinced that the true evidence is outside. I mean, it's just hard. I don't know how to explain it. The evidence doesn't seem that strong to me. I believe it. Okay, I'm not saying that, but the evidence doesn't seem that strong.
Well, so if we take the Gospels and the New Testament writings by themselves, which we could, I think, there are certain features of those sources that most people don't realize. I think a lot of people make the assumption that the Gospels were all written in parallel by all 4 of the authors sitting next to each other in a room, and they were all conspiring to compile their writings together into a holy book. And that's not true. They were written years apart, miles apart, and they all corroborate with each other, and they were only compiled into canon hundreds of years later. So I think skeptics are resistant to accepting those sources as credible sources because they operate under the assumption that they conspired to corroborate with each other because they happen to all be in the Bible, but they weren't. It's not like they were all sitting next to each other in a room writing down, what do you got down? Okay, I'll write that too. Like they were written years, sometimes decades apart from each other, and they were all over the Mediterranean, and they were only compiled together in the Bible hundreds of years after that. But even beyond that, there are other non-biblical sources, and we can go into that if we want to do one of the resurrection appearances of Jesus is Gary Habermas essay we could cover. But anyway, the point that I was trying to get at is that we have these facts. We have the empty tomb. We have the appearances of Jesus. We have the disciples' willingness to die for what they believed. And so all of these facts need an explanation. So if your explanatory scope is limited only to the physical world, of course you're going to reject the explanation that Jesus was raised from the dead, because Jesus being raised from the dead would require a transcendent explanation. It would require an explanation that defies the physical universe. So that's why, science would say, well, Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. Even though that's the simplest, easiest, most likely explanation, that still can't be accepted because science does not permit anything outside the physical universe, right? So the scientific explanation would require so many other complications to explain these facts, even though the most simple, most likely, most probable, best explanation, exceeds the physical universe.
There's a whole section on naturalism as well, which I think would be good to go over. But part of it, they talk about reason itself. How does anybody know if we did evolve from unguided, uncreated, just happen by chance, how do we know our thoughts are even real or they're even accurate or true? So I'll read a little bit of what they said about that.
Which one is this?
It's page 30. It's naturalism.
Oh, the Russ Bush.
Yeah. Reason itself is the naturalistic worldview, or in the naturalistic worldview, is nothing more than the natural and random result of particular random changing of an independent. Is a result of a particular randomly changing original bit of matter. Reason is not really an independent evaluative process that can critique itself. Reason is only what the chemistry allows through the self-arrangement and self-organization, and the shaping of logic and rationality and grammatical language is merely a chance result of an undesigned process that has no necessary relation to truth or meaning. All truth could be merely a pragmatic, qualified set of ideas. No intrinsic truth would exist, and yet naturalists claim that naturalism itself is true. But how could that claim avoid the inevitable skeptical conclusion? Nothing can be known for sure to be objectively true, for there is no standard other than the chemical pattern one happens to be using at the time. Why should reason be trusted? How could naturalism be known to be true? The answer is it can't.
Yeah, Alvin Plantinga argues that even if evolutionary naturalism were true, even if evolution were true, we still should not believe it because it offers no evolutionary benefit. So evolution argues that it's the survival of the fittest. Well, if you have knowledge of survival of the fittest, then how does that benefit you? Like, if you believe in that, how does that benefit you? I suppose maybe it would motivate you to get fit so that you could be the survivor, but it's funny because even if it is true, you should not put stock into it. You shouldn't believe in it.
That's part of. Those are some of the issues with Darwinism. So in the chapter we just went over this week, Charles Darwin himself argued a fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each equation. So in today's climate of public educational policy, this would mean, at a minimum, teaching not just the strengths of Darwin's theory, but also the evidence that challenges it. For example, any complete theory of biological origins must examine fossil evidence. The fossils of the Cambrian explosion show virtually all the basic forms of animal life appearing suddenly without clear precursors.
Yeah, it kind of cracks me up whenever I go into a science museum and I see the Cambrian explosion. It's like, huh.
So Darwin's, that's one theory, one issue with Darwin's thing. The other is it doesn't explain what's called macroevolution or big evolution from single cells to super complex. It only gives you small little differences, changes in colors or beak size or right, and that's always existing genetic information just being using different parts of the DNA. They've never observed new DNA, only mutations or loss of DNA or information. They've never seen new information. So there's multiple points of Darwin's. There's issues, all kinds of issues, but they don't talk about those. They don't even talk about the simple ones and make it so simple they create the straw man argument. This is what we evolved, this is the theory, and then now we're going to go on, and that's it.
This is a leap, but this is on my mind because I read it the other day. How can something non-human become human when they're talking about abortion? They're saying that unborn baby is non-human. At what point can we all agree upon that this non-human entity or mass of cells became human? And some talk it's only when it makes the magical birth process, and others at some point. I mean, at what point? It's like saying when I was pregnant, I met this girl that had 7 abortions, and now she decided that she was going to have this baby. And people, when I relate that, they say 7's too many. Well,
1 is too many.
how many is too many? I know 1 is too many, but how many? When you're talking to people that believe in abortion, if 7's too many, is 5 too many?
Well, they believe in abortion, then I don't think any would be too many.
Well, people are shocked because this is a true statement. I truly did meet this lady who proceeded to get drunk and take off with somebody else at this. I was at a coffee shop kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Well, what do you suppose?
Well, when a human, I think it's has nothing to do with evolution. I think at conception, it's a human being. I think life exists. It's growing, it's developing, it's becoming just simply a bigger human.
So the moment that the sperm and the egg meet.
I believe human life has been created.
I agree.
And that's one of the things that science can't answer.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's not a scientific question.
Right, so we've covered a whole landscape of topics today, and I hope that it hasn't been terribly overwhelming, but the point that at least we were trying to get at in this session was the limitations of science.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were sitting in a room with a high school student and I was trying to explain to them what every high school student needs to know about science, it's that science, while valuable and important, has limitations. Science cannot explain the why, it can only explain the how. There are a whole host of things that science just does not have access to because it's not omniscient. Science is not omniscient. Science will not lead you to all truths. Sure, there's, a great many truths that can be found through science, but there are a lot of big things that science does not have access to. And it's important to remember that because I think a lot of people, a lot of naturalists put stock in that. They think that science is omniscient and that anything and everything can be known through science. It's only a matter of time. And I think, just my opinion, I think that that's rooted in a human need for certainty. I think people, and maybe it's a product of the information age. Maybe it's a product of living in a world where information is so readily available, so easily accessible through television, radio, internet, cell phones, that information is just so saturated that people hunger for certainty. That if they're not completely certain about something, then they don't trust they don't trust the truth of it. And I think that's another reason why a lot of people are so skeptical of faith in of God and Christianity and religion in general, because God is hidden. We have to have faith, and that faith requires effort, obviously, because God is hidden. But people want absolute certainty. I mean, how many times have you heard atheists in debates where they're like, "Oh yeah, I would believe in God if God opened up the clouds and said, I'm sick and tired of your logic chopping. I do exist." Is that enough?
Makes people uncomfortable to not be able to explain things, like not being able to totally explain the beginning of the universe, or not totally being able. It's an uncomfortable feeling to say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. But it's kind of funny because some I'm mainly talking about Carl Sagan, would they talk out of both sides of their mouth, because on the other side they would say, well, it's better to just have the intellectual humility to admit, I don't have the answer, but I want to find out. Like if you've ever seen the movie Contact, that's like the whole. That's the whole like, horn that he's tooting is if you don't have all the answers, you got to have the intellectual humility to just admit I don't know, but I want to find out. So it's kind of funny.
Well, and in that movie, they actually talked about it in one of the last chapters we read. I remember the different signals that they're getting back from space, and they're observing it, and they see that that has a pattern, it's an intelligence to it, something. So they must be aliens, life outside of Earth.
When the prime numbers you were talking about?
Yeah. It's a good movie. If you've never seen it, I enjoy it.
I've seen it years ago. Jodie Foster.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I like the movie.
So it's okay to attribute intelligence to aliens, but not to a creator God.
Not to DNA.
Yeah. So the other part of this is, so what John had said about what science can explain and its limitations, and also within the science itself, there's different fields of science, so there's different views and sides to it. And students, as well as everybody, should be exposed to all of it so they can make their decision, not solely be looking at one arm or viewpoint of it, aka Darwinism or whatever it may be. Even Darwin himself said we have to look at both sides. We have to look at the issues of each to be able to determine what's true and what's not.
Darwin said that?
Yes.
Yeah, it's where did he say this?
It's page 70. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question. Oh, he says all kinds of other stuff.
Oh yeah, here it is. Charles Darwin himself argued a fair result can only be obtained by fully stating. Yep.
Charles Darwin makes, and if you read his books or watch videos or whatnot, documents on him, documentaries, he says all kinds of stuff like that all the time. Stuff that a lot of people don't talk about. So
Yeah, the main takeaway, I hope, is just simply that science is important, science is valuable, but science is limited.
Science is limited. Okay. So what are we going to do next week?
Good question.
And I've got to tell you, I'm going to miss 3 weeks in November.
Okay.
The 5th, I'm at Vanguard Church promoting Crossfire.
Oh, nice.
And then yesterday I went to Life Surge. It had Priscilla Shire and Tim Tebow and other people, and it talked about becoming
I haven't seen that. That's
financially stronger to be able to support the kingdom work. Well, I signed up for 2 workshops, both of them in November. In fact, I'll miss my board of directors meeting and I'll miss my comforters luncheon, but I thought it was important.
Yeah,
it is,
free
yeah.
or make pay for
It was $197
Wow.
for the one on investments, and then you could take somebody with you, and then you got the software. And then when they talked the real estate seminar, they said if you signed up for the investment one, this is free, and you can still bring someone, and it's 3 days. So, impulse that I am, I bought it, and I'm hoping, I am 69.
Yep.
It is too late for me to have a 20-year investment or something like that. But I'm hoping my son will go.
Yeah.
For him.
I had some mixed feelings on those types of classes.
I did. It was different thinking about it. I did have, is it just a Christian way of promoting to make money? There were different speakers, and one talks about digital currency. So really, I was thinking, is investments the way to go if we're going to digital currency? I don't know. But I'd like my son to be exposed to it and make his own decisions.
There's lots of truths in those things, and they have great information. That I'll give to them. I was at Charis Bible College during the men's conference, and their CEO, I forget his name. He
Andrew
talked about
Womack?
it's his CEO
Oh, okay.
or CFO. I forget. He was talking about all of that same stuff, and it's like, so he talked about his story and how he became financially independent and how his money makes him money. He doesn't have to work. He has so much money. Blah blah blah. And he's like, if you sign up for my class, I'll give you a discount. But the whole thing, he was talking about how he makes so much money. He makes so much money from making money that
You
it's
shouldn't
a
need
lot
to
of
charge.
money. Yes.
I know it.
Pastors don't charge for truth. If it's truth in the Bible and God, and if it's really for kingdom work to get the kingdom out there, why would you limit it to have people having to pay for it? I don't know.
I know, and I paid $197 because I could afford it. I did do that.
There is good information in there.
Well, I don't want you to feel bad about missing Defenders. It's okay.
No,
oh,
3
yeah,
weeks in a row. So I'll watch the videos, but have light topics.
Yeah.
Because you know
Well,
I
don't
like
feel
to
bad
ask
about
questions.
So this morning actually posed kind of an interesting question, because before you got here, we are like, well, nobody's here. What do we do? So if no one shows up, we'll just extend the topic an extra week.
Okay.
So, and I'll send out emails like I do every week. So no worries at all.
Well, when I sent the email, it was 10 to 9, and I was still in bed going, oh
That's
my
okay.
gosh.
It's okay. No worries.
But I felt so bad about that. I
No,
thought, what
don't
if
feel
no one shows up? And it's okay to be late.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to be late. It's okay not to show up. It's all right. I mean, there's no pressure, no hard feelings or anything. No worries at all.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's decide. What am I reading?
Boy, we covered so much today. It's like, man, we could do the moral argument. We could do the resurrection of Jesus. We could do. We were all over the place today.
The resurrection of Jesus would be a good one,
Sure,
I think. Where is that one at?
Oh, there's a bunch. There's so many.
Well, pick one.
Uh,
Was the resurrection? Oh, there it is. There's 2 resurrection ones.
well, there's 3. The Empty Tomb by Gary Habermas and the Resurrection Appearances. Those are 2 of the 3 facts.
Which one would be first, do you think?
We could
We
probably
should
do
take them in
multiple.
order.
Yeah, we probably do 2.
You want to do 2 of them?
It doesn't matter to me.
I think these are short enough. You can.
Which ones?
The empty tomb and the resurrection appearance. Is that what you're saying,
Sure.
Randy?
Both are Gary
Yeah.
Habermas. Gary Habermas
Yeah.
is like
Yeah,
the
that's good.
man. When it comes to the historical Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, Gary Habermas is the dude.
All right.
Should we?
Okay, so the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances. Perfect. That should be good. That'll be good. And it's a good segue, because today we talked about like the limited explanatory scope of science and how that'll play into explaining the resurrection of Jesus, because if your explanatory scope is limited only to that which you can explain with the physical world, then a miracle is going to be really hard to explain. So, yeah, it'll be great. Well, let's close with prayer. Father, we love you, and your works are amazing. Your creation, miracles that you perform are just awe-inspiring. Father, I pray that you would just open the eyes of our heart this week as we study your word and study the facts surrounding your resurrection. And Lord, I just pray that you would ordain opportunities for us to share the good news of the truth of Jesus' resurrection with those around us. And I pray that you would just open our eyes to that and illuminate like a spotlight what you would have us to do to grow your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.